During the Nazi years, Munich was given the honorary title Capital of the Movement. After the fall of the Third Reich, however, its citizens wanted to do away with the city's fascist past, and Munich suppressed its National Socialist history. Yet remnants of the time are still omnipresent in Bavaria's capital, shaping the cityscape to this day. The Nazis inaugurated the new buildings with huge celebrations, perfectly staged for maximum propaganda effect. On the Day of German Art in 1937, for instance, all the Nazi notables were assembled in Munich. On some house fronts, the symbols of the Wehrmacht and the Nazi Party are visible to this day. Not all of them were removed at the end of the war. The remains of the so-called Brauner's house, however, were filled in 60 years ago and only recently excavated. Hitler had great plans for Munich. The entire city centre was to be redesigned. An original model illustrating the mammoth project to survive the war undamaged. A boulevard was to lead to the newly constructed railway station. Its enormous dome would have towered above all other buildings in the area. Hitler, who had always dreamt of being an architect, paid regular visits to the construction site, carefully scrutinizing the ongoing work. Today, hardly a trace remains of the fact that the Königsplatz was one of the centers of the National Socialist movement. After remodeling the square, the Nazis used it for their marches. In addition, Königsplatz was also the stage for an annual propaganda event honoring the early martyrs of the party, a pseudo-religious cult of the dead.
National Socialism started out in this city. This is where the German Workers' Party, the forerunner of the NSDAP, was founded in 1919. This is where the SA, the SS and the Hitler Youth were formed. This is where the Reich headquarters of the NSDAP were located. This is where Adolf Hitler rose from being an insignificant army informer to the leader of the most powerful party in Germany.
After the end of the First World War, Munich's pubs were used by all political parties as venues for their meetings. In 1919, the army sent Adolf Hitler to spy on a meeting of the German Workers' Party in the Sternecker brewery. But instead of passing information to his superiors, Hitler himself joined the party, which changed its name to NSDAP, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, early in 1920, and took over its leadership within a few months. The fact that the patrons in Munich's breweries were usually intoxicated made it easy to stir up emotions. Even back then, the Hofbräuhaus was one of the most popular beer halls. The Nazis were quick to realize that the atmosphere here ideally suited their purposes. So along with the Sternecker brewery and the Bürgerbräu and Löwenbräu cellars, the Hofbräuhaus was one of the first centers of the National Socialist movement.
Munich was a very fertile breeding ground for the National Socialist ideas, which were mainly nationalism, racism and anti-Semitism. These ideas of an initially small extremist right-wing group were very well received here. It all originated in the beer cellars, where heated speeches fueled up resentment after the lost war.
Political meetings had been held in the Great Ballroom since the beginning of the 20th century. The hall was largely destroyed by Allied air raids at the end of the Second World War and was rebuilt in 1950. Hitler, too, used the charged atmosphere in the beer halls as a stage for his preposterous and grotesque rantings. In 1937, on the occasion of the Nazi Party's 14th anniversary, he gave a speech on the birth of the Nazi movement in the ballroom of the Hofbräuhaus.
Ich weiß, dass damals viele die Aussichtslosigkeit dieser Bewegung beurteilten nach dem Maß ihrer damaligen Größe und dem Maß der Größe der Aufgaben, die gestellt waren. Wollen wir denn in dieser Stunde wieder unseren alten Schlachtruf ausstoßen? Unsere nationalsozialistische Partei, unser deutsches Volk und unser deutsches Reich dienen Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil!
Hitler was determined to take up the fight against the hated Weimar Republic. Together with General Ludendorff, a prominent World War veteran, and several thousand supporters, he attempted a revolt on the 9th of November 1923. Their march was stopped at the Feldherrenhalle. 4 policemen and 16 putschists died in the shootout. The putsch leaders were arrested. After seizing power in 1933, the Nazi leaders held a commemorative ceremony here every year for the early martyrs of the movement. The 9th of November was declared a national holiday, and the Odeonsplatz Square became one of the central places commemorating the bloodshed and the martyrs. The Nazis put up a plaque with the names of all the victims outside the Feldherrenhalle, which passers-by had to salute in honor of the dead. The shrine was removed by the Americans in 1945. Since 1994, a memorial slab on the ground honors the memory of the 4 policemen killed in that gunfight. Only 3 months after the failed putsch, its initiators, Adolf Hitler, Erich Ludendorff, and another 8 National Socialists, were tried for high treason. Due to the enormous interest of the public and among the press, the trial was held in the military school for safety reasons. The verdict was lenient. Hitler had supporters in the judiciary system and the police.
Munich politicians, as well as the police, strongly inclined to the right. There were close ties between the NSDAP and many senior police officials, and these people more or less facilitated the rise of the party. The local press also helped to spread Nazi literature. It was a collaboration which really only existed here in Munich.
Das war eine Konstellation, wie es sie eben nur in München gab.
At the end of 1924, after only 10 months, Hitler was released from the fortress where he was being held. During his time in prison, he dictated the script for Mein Kampf to his later deputy, Rudolf Hess. On his return to Munich, Hitler sought to consolidate the party's position. In 1925, the re-established NSDAP opened its offices on the premises of the Völkischer Beobachter newspaper in the Lehel district. Within 2 years, the number of members had trebled. By 1928, over 100,000 names were listed in the National Socialist Party's records. These pictures from the head office show a young Heinrich Himmler as an eager assistant. Soon he will become one of the most unscrupulous henchmen of the Nazi regime and the man responsible for the death of millions. Soon afterward, the party headquarters were moved to the district of Schwabing. When the number of members trebled again in 1930 compared to the previous year, Hitler started to look for an imposing building, quote, befitting the importance and the calling of the NSDAP. Palais Barlow, a classical building near Königsplatz, was found. In January 1931, Hitler and his 56 assistants moved into the stately property, which from then on was popularly known as Brauner's House. In the summer of 2006, a team of experts worked here for 6 months to uncover the foundations of the former Nazi Party headquarters, of which only the cellar walls remain intact. Munich's new documentation center for the National Socialist era will be constructed on this historically significant site in 2008. But before the remainders of the past are eliminated, the ruins of the Brauners house are to be archaeologically surveyed and evaluated in detail.
It was clear to all of us involved that one could not just commence with the structural planning here. Before that, we would have to examine what used to be the basement and see what we could find, mainly for 2 reasons. Firstly, to see if we could make any discoveries which might be used in the later documentation. We now know this is clearly not the case. Or, and that would have been the negative scenario, if we found something that might prevent the concept, which would have forced us to rethink the whole plan.
Oder ob man, das wäre sozusagen der negative Fall gewesen, hier in Anführungszeichen Entdeckungen machen würde, die dem Konzept im Wege stünden und man dann von neu nachdenken müsste.
But this was not the case either. Things have been relatively unspectacular since we began here in August. We've discovered a maze of walls that look exciting, but nothing of extraordinary contemporary historical significance.
Aber das ist nur nichts von herausragender zeitgeschichtlicher Bedeutung.
That was the initial opinion of the experts involved in the project, until they discovered aluminium stencils with set-in copies for party documents. This proved that the cellar had contained the records office of the Nazi Party, which was believed to be lost. When American troops occupied Munich in May 1945, they found that the Palais Barlow had been razed to the ground by 2 direct hits of Allied bombers. The ruins were looted by Munich citizens and GIs. Anything of use was taken away. Soon afterward, the site was leveled. It was only 60 years later that the Regional Office for the Preservation of Historic Monuments decided to unearth the ruins. Moritz Tannebauer is the on-site director of this uncovering project.
This is the cellar of the Brauners house. Of course, the area looked totally different when we started out. It was covered by a nice lawn, and we had no idea what to expect. We started excavating and uncovered all the walls, then the individual rooms. Where we are now, for instance, was the kitchen area. Over there, one of our people is making a sketch of the walls. The walls have been cleaned, of course, to show up every detail. The kitchen here had direct access to the dining area, which consisted of several rooms, one behind the other, with wooden floors and paneling on the walls. We take photographs, draw, survey and analyze, just like we would do in any archaeological excavation. Now we're in the boiler room. The big boiler which was here was used until the building was connected to the main heating system during the construction of the so-called Führerbau. From here, we enter the machinery room, which is not part of the old Palais Barlow. That's obvious from the thickness of the walls. Here they created a passageway to this extension, which was built in 1931 and was mainly used for technical installations, such as a pump station for sewage. This was the foundation for the pumps they used to dispose of waste.
Und wo da eben das Schmutzwasser wieder herausgenommen werden konnte aus dem Haus.
Despite the new discoveries, the authorities are sticking to their plans to remove the remains of the Nazi past in 2007. A possible incorporation of the existing cellars into the new building for the Nazi Documentation Center is not favored. The final decision on the design will be made in 1 year, after an invitation to tender. But by then, the historically important cellar structures will have long disappeared. Adolf Hitler's private dwelling was on the other side of the River Isar. He lived in a 400-square-meter apartment on the fashionable Prinzregentenplatz, where he had moved in 1929. Wealthy supporters paid the rent for this luxurious apartment. Today, the building houses a police station. Chief Inspector Dieter Vögele has been researching the history of the house for many years.
Das sind die Räume der Hitlerwohnung.
These are the rooms of Hitler's apartment. It occupied a total area of 397.5 square meters.
Da befindet sich in diesem Raum
This is the hallway.
Teil vom Ess- und Speisezimmer.
That room was part of the dining room.
Und Speisezimmer. Da haben wir das
This was the living room.
Zimmer, wo die
And here was the guest room where Geli Raubal lived.
Hitler's niece took her own life under mysterious circumstances in her uncle's apartment in 1931. Apparently, Hitler never got over her suicide. After her death, no one except himself was allowed to enter her room. Today, it serves as a storage room.
geht's dann weiter in das Bad.
The bathroom is through there.
Zimmern zu betreten
It was
war.
accessible from both rooms.
Und jetzt kommen wir in die sperrig
And
eingerichtete
this was his Spartan bedroom, with just a bed, a table, and a small cupboard.
ein Schränkchen gestanden ist. Hier haben wir einen Teil vom Wohnzimmer.
This was part of the living
Von
room.
unserer Dienststelle.
We're using it as a computer training room today.
Und hier haben wir
And this is the vintage library from the time of the United Workshops in Munich.
aus der Zeit von den Vereinigten Werkstätten in München gefertigt. Und die war vollgestellt.
It was
mit
crammed with
Literatur,
books
weil
because Hitler was a
Hitler war
very
ein sehr
well-read
belesener
man.
Mensch. Und jetzt
Now we use it to display the cups we've won at police football championships.
das für die sportlichen Erfolge, die wir erzielt haben in puncto Fußball. Und hier war dann die Couch.
And this is the exact spot where the couch stood on which Geli Raubal was found dead in September 1931.
The original air raid shelter can still be found in the cellar. Hitler had ordered it to be built for himself and the other residents. As of 1938, he owned the entire building. In accordance with the regulations, this private shelter was approved by the local building control office just after the beginning of the war, in November 1939. The panelled room in the centre of the underground shelter was obviously reserved for the dictator. However, Hitler never used this bunker. After the war began, he spent very little time in his Munich home. After the accession to power in 1933, the Nazis systematically began to eliminate the remaining democratic elements all across the Reich. Stormtrooper marches became part of the daily routine in Munich's streets too. The elected Bavarian government capitulated without resistance on the 9th of March. Now opponents of the new regime were mercilessly persecuted and sent to the nearby concentration camp in Dachau. This footage shows the arrival of the newly elected Reich Chancellor at Munich's Riem airport. From now on, Hitler mainly stayed in the Reich's capital. His visits to Munich became less and less frequent.
The
The political power of the National Socialists was gradually transferred to Berlin, and then after 1933, Berlin became the center of political power. But Adolf Hitler had explicitly decreed that Munich, which was given the honorary title Capital of the Movement in 1935, should remain the seat of the NSDAP national headquarters.
Sitz der Reichsleitung der NSDAP bleiben solle. Deswegen sind hier von allen
This is the reason why certain institutions from all the party's administrative departments had their offices here, in the area between Königsplatz and Karolinenplatz.
und Karolinenplatz.
The Nazis have been using the area around Königsplatz for their marches since the early days. On Hitler's decree, the site was to be converted to a forum of the movement. Paul Ludwig Trost, one of the Führer's preferred architects, had the square tiled with granite slabs especially for their marches, in order to amplify the noise produced by the parading formations. It was the first major construction project of the new government, and Hitler frequently inspected its progress. Rare footage from the personal archives of Albert Speer shows him probably in the autumn of 1935. The dictator was interested in every detail. After the Königsplatz, he went on to examine the two so-called blood temples at the front of the square and afterwards the shell of the Führerbau. His plan was to have a complex built covering the entire area between Karolinenplatz and Königsplatz to accommodate the party headquarters. The Führerbau was erected next to the identically constructed NSDAP administration building on the eastern side of Königsplatz. The imposing building was intended to be used for receptions and state ceremonies and was accordingly pompously furnished. Nazi propaganda claimed that some of Hitler's own ideas had been incorporated in the plans. However, he didn't show up here often. As of 1957, the building was used by the College for Theatre and Music. The Munich Agreement was signed on the 29th of September 1938, here in Hitler's former study. In the previous months, Nazi propaganda had been reporting on alleged ill treatment of the Sudeten German minority in Czechoslovakia. With this treaty, the European powers agreed to the German Reich's annexation of Sudetenland in the hope of preventing a war. A year later, the German Wehrmacht invaded Poland. The underground tunnel system beneath the Führerbau has also survived.
This is one of the underground connecting passages. The entire party headquarters was subterraneously connected. This is the tunnel that led to the Brauner's house. Over there is a longer tunnel that went beneath Brienner Straße, ending at the NSDAP administration building. On the walls, you can still see all the graffiti the Americans left behind.
American GIs scrawled their initials on the walls in 1945. Over 60 years later, these inscriptions indicate the stations of their deployment during the war.
These were the storerooms of the Führerbau. As the compound mainly served representational purposes, receptions and banquets and so on, they needed large storage facilities for supplies. This was the beer cellar, and over there was the red wine cellar. After the war, the Americans wrote, "Keep out, Germans and co." This was the potato cellar, which was looted by the locals before the Americans arrived. The guards had already left by then. Before the Americans came, people forced open this door. The bullet holes are still visible.
The plan was to build a new party chancellery for the NSDAP leadership, the counterpart to the Reich Chancellor in Berlin, right next to the Führerbau. Construction for the monstrous administration building commenced in 1938. Atelier Trost, a Munich-based firm of architects, had done the design work. But construction was suspended at the beginning of the Second World War, so the chancellery was never built. The only parts that had been completed were the enormous underground bunkers. Originally, all air raid protection facilities in the party district were connected, so that all the buildings would remain accessible in case of emergency. These shelters were intended to be used exclusively by Nazi functionaries. Only when the Allied bombing attacks on Munich intensified was the party bunker opened to the civilian population. The building that houses the Institute of the city's Technical University was erected on top of the bunker in 1970. In the course of 2007, the underground tunnel system will have to make room for a new building of the College for Television and Film. In 1937, 4 years after the foundation stone was laid, the House of German Arts, another Nazi edifice in Munich, was ceremoniously inaugurated with a procession. From now on, the Day of German Art was to be celebrated here every year. But the war put a stop to these plans. There were only 3 processions in all. When exhibitions opened in the House of German Arts, they were frequently staged as pompous propaganda spectacles. The museum is one of the few representational buildings of the Nazi regime which were actually built in Munich. These celebrations always attracted many Nazi notables to Munich. Adolf Hitler himself attended the Great Exhibition of German Art. In 1939, he was given a guided tour of the exhibition rooms by Gerdi Trost, the widow of the architect. Art that conformed to his regime was to the Führer's taste. Until 1944, the presentation of what the Nazis considered to be art took place annually.
Das festliche Haus der deutschen Kunst wirkt auch im 4. Kriegsjahr die Schöpfungen führender deutscher Maler und Bildhauer. Das ganze Volk nimmt mit offenem Herzen Anteil am Kunstschaffen der Gegenwart. Wir erleben das Antlitz deutscher Männer und Frauen. Die gestraffte Figur eines Arbeiters. Neue Quellen des künstlerischen Schaffens erschließt der Krieg. Es ergreifen uns zutiefst der beherrschte Schmerz im Gesicht des Verwundeten und die vom eben beendeten Kampf noch aufgewühlten Züge des Soldatenhauptes.
Hitler had been directly involved in the planning for this building too. He even laid down the exact site where it was to be built. At the inauguration, he described the stone-clad museum as the first beautiful building of the new Reich. Art is a sublime mission and an obligation to fanaticism, added the dictator. After the war, a section of the undamaged building was used as an officers' mess by the Americans until 1955. The rest of the building remained a museum. At the same place as the Nazis had staged their notorious show of so-called degenerate art in 1937, visitors could now view works of art that had been banned during the Thousand-Year Reich. The Haus der Kunst is still used for exhibitions of all kinds today.
Der Führer besichtigte mit dem italienischen Minister Lantini die neu eröffnete Architektur- und Kunsthandwerksausstellung in München. Die Ausstellung bringt einen Rechenschaftsbericht über die neuen großen Bauten in Deutschland.
In Munich too, Hitler let his architectural megalomania run wild. The buildings he commissioned for the capital of the movement exceeded all reasonable dimensions. The original model for the restructuring of Munich into the Führer's city has survived the war undamaged. It is exhibited in Munich's Municipal Museum. The planning did not just entail individual buildings. The whole city was to be redesigned. The new face of Munich would symbolically present the city's role as the birthplace of National Socialism.
Geplant war nun,
They were planning to erect a grand forum at the end of each Autobahn dedicated to the so-called pillars of the party, the SA, the SS and the Hitler Youth. So the pillars of the party would literally support the capital of the movement. Starting from these forums, they were going to build wide access roads to the places of historical significance for the party. For example, one would be able to drive directly from a forum to the Bürgerbräukeller.
Hitler entrusted the implementation of his vision to architect Hermann Giesler. Jochen Wilk was one of the people working in the architect's office at that time.
Giesler was quite close to the Führer, who would frequently summon him for progress reports. Hitler approved of more or less everything that Giesler presented to him, but occasionally there were issues about which Hitler had made up his mind and wouldn't budge, and Giesler had to accept that without question.
The most hideous plans were those for the new central railway station. The original model is currently being restored by experts in Munich's Municipal Museum. It hasn't been on display for many years because of its poor state of preservation. Christian Hale's team is now putting the remaining parts of the model together. The old terminus station was to be replaced by a new gigantic through station further west, featuring a huge dome construction.
The dome was supposed to cover 20 double tracks, which means the dimensions would have been huge. The first plans provided for a diameter of 245 meters, but it soon became clear that this wouldn't be enough, so it was increased to 265. Based on this figure, a complete plan was then drawn up for the whole station, including static calculations and so on.
Whether the huge dome would have been feasible is highly doubtful. Starting from the new station, a new east-west axis, the so-called Prachtstraße, or Glorious Boulevard, would then lead into the city centre.
Essentially, all this would have been just enormous blocks, relatively undifferentiated. All they were planning to do was line up facades. The functionality of these constructions didn't interest anyone at first, or even at this stage of planning.
The plan was to erect an oversized column of the party at the end of this road, on the site of the old terminus station. Just like the new station's dome, this column is another indication of Hitler's megalomaniac fantasies.
The column was not Giesler's creation. The original design was Speer's. Giesler revised the column several times because he found it too tall and too chunky at the base. But basically, none of us working in Giesler's office were keen on that column. It was never a popular project, the column of the party. Its design was wrong from an urban planning aspect. It was much too big, and it would have ended up being even taller than the towers of the Frauenkirche.
The Nazis planned to display the so-called Blutfahne, or blood flag, from Hitler's 1923 putsch in the base of the column. Just as in other cities of the Reich, the first victims of this urban restructuring were the Jewish citizens. On the 9th of June 1938, 5 months before the Night of Broken Glass, the main Munich synagogue was demolished upon Adolf Hitler's personal orders. The Jewish community was charged with the demolition costs of the building. The authorities claimed traffic-related problems to justify the demolition. In reality, the discrimination of Jewish citizens was well advanced by then. The Aryanization of Jewish companies and businesses had already begun in 1933. For years, Andreas Häusler from Munich City Archives has been investigating the erosion of Jewish citizens' rights in the Bavarian capital. The Jewish community in Munich was quite large. 1,700 Jewish businesses were still registered in the city at the beginning of 1938.
Jewish economic activity was evident in every part of the city. However, one can trace the gradual disappearance of these businesses. I believe it had a lot to do with Munich's reputation as the birthplace of the National Socialist movement. People here were particularly compliant and dedicated when carrying out the wishes of the Nazi leaders.
The city archives contain tens of thousands of files on cases of Aryanization. Nazi bureaucracy meticulously recorded every process and every document. Many citizens shamelessly used the plight of their Jewish neighbors to enrich themselves.
One could say that banishing the Jews from economic life triggered off a kind of gold digger mentality among the population. The Jews were losing their entire possessions, and the other citizens used the opportunity to get hold of these objects at auctions or otherwise.
Bürger sich bei Versteigerungen oder sonstigen Gelegenheiten diese Objekte an Land zu ziehen. Ein besonders interessanter Fall ist das Unternehmen von Heinrich Cohen.
One of the most interesting cases is Heinrich Cohen. He owned a very well-known textile store in Munich, a long-established and financially sound business. After 1933, his business naturally tempted so-called Aryanizers.
Dann auch die Begehrlichkeiten von sogenannten Aryseuren geweckt.
The person who finally acquired this business was an employee of Lord & Frey, a large clothing manufacturer. Because he didn't have enough capital, he was helped by the Lord & Frey management and managed to buy Heinrich Cohen's business at a very favorable price.
Natürlich zu einem sehr günstigen Preis. Nach 1945.
After 1945, no one was particularly interested in the pre-war history of the company. The new owner, a certain Stieler, was never questioned on how he had acquired the business or his wealth. On the contrary, he rose to a kind of jet-setter and became part of Munich's in-crowd.
Der sich immer sehr gerne in der schicken Münchner Society bewegt hat.
Munich was not only the city of the party, it was also the city of resistance against the regime. It was here that students of the White Rose Group distributed their leaflets, and carpenter Georg Elser almost succeeded in his assassination attempt on Hitler. On the evening of the 8th of November 1938, a homemade bomb exploded in the Bürgerbräu-Keller. For over a month, Elser had been hollowing out a pillar in the hall where Hitler gave his annual memorial speech and stashed the bomb inside.
Attentat auf die traditionelle Führerkundgebung im historischen Bürgerbräu-Keller. Der Führer hatte die Versammlungsstätte kurze Zeit vor der Katastrophe verlassen. Wäre die Kundgebung wie üblich verlaufen, so hätte der Mordplan sein Ziel erreicht. Die Stelle, an der der Führer bei seiner Rede stand, war nach dem Anschlag mit einem 3 Meter hohen Trümmerhaufen bedeckt. 8 Tote und 63 Verletzte forderte dieses gemeine Verbrechen.
Hitler had left the hall much earlier than planned and was on his private train to Berlin when the device went off. The Nazis immediately accused the British of plotting the assassination attempt, and in order to feed the propaganda machinery, 2 British spies were arrested on the following day. The actual perpetrator was already in custody at the time. The border police had arrested him while trying to flee to Switzerland. His ambitious motive had been to liberate Germany from the tyrants. Georg Elser died in the Dachau concentration camp in 1945. The victims of the bomb attack were laid out in front of the Feldherrenhalle. Again, the historically charged location at Odeonsplatz served as a backdrop for a celebration of the Nazi cult of the dead. National Socialist propaganda stylized the bomb victims to heroes and martyrs.
Die Opfer des gemeinen Bombenanschlages wurden vor der Feldherrnhalle aufgebahrt. Tag und Nacht defilierte hier die Münchner Bevölkerung in ergriffener Trauer vorbei, die Toten noch einmal zu grüßen.
Hitler attributed his luck to an act of providence. The pseudo-religious dimension of his regime's rule was now consolidated once and for all. Even prior to this attempt, the dictator had often claimed that fate had chosen him for this task.
Der Führer erwies seinen getreuen Kämpfern die letzte Ehre. Der Stellvertreter des Führers hielt die Traueransprache
in der er von den Opfern dieses grauenhaften Verbrechens Abschied nahm. Ein Wunder habe den Führer vor dem Tode bewahrt, den ruchlose Mörderhand ihm bestimmt hatte. Die Vorsehung, die uns den Führer gesandt hat, werde ihn uns auch für die Zukunft bewahren.
Critical journalist Ruth Andreas Friedrich wrote in her diary during that time, "For Hitler's opponents, it has been clear since 1933 that the Thousand-Year Reich will go to war sooner or later, a war which Germany is bound to lose. We have had 6 years to get used to this idea, but now an end with terror almost seems more bearable than terror without an end." Housing developments were built on the outskirts of Munich for the ordinary folk. This model development in Rammersdorf was based on plans drawn up during the Weimar Republic, which the Nazis then simply adopted. In case of war, the gardens would help the residents to become self-sufficient. The settlement plans for Munich were abandoned in 1935. One of the reasons was the high cost. Also, the Nazis considered such housing projects bourgeois and traditionalist. The Nazis erected entire towns consisting of such developments all over the Reich as part of a gigantic construction project. A propaganda film of the German Labour Front was to make life in a settlement more attractive to the comrades.
Viele Arbeitskameraden haben den Wunsch nach einer eigenen Heimstätte. Diese Heimstättensiedlungen werden vom Reichsheimstättenamt der Deutschen Arbeitsfront entwickelt. Das Reichsheimstättenamt führt sowohl die Planung des Hauses als auch die wirtschaftliche Planung des Gartens durch. Zweckmäßig und schön ist die Einteilung der Wohnräume. Ebenso zweckmäßig und schön die Einrichtungsgegenstände, die vom Reichsheimstättenamt entworfen und mit geringen Mitteln zu beschaffen sind. Heimat auf eigenem Boden. Unser Siedlerpaar sieht sich und seine Familie schon in Gedanken in dieser bis ins Kleinste vom Reichsheimstättenamt wohnlich und behaglich entworfenen Heimstätte.
At Munich's Prinzregentenstraße, an enormous experimental construction project for the residents of the so-called Südstadt or South Town has survived. These satellite towns were planned as independent subsystems within the city. The uniform apartment blocks were given names such as Wallgau, Inn or Alpenland, suggesting coziness in a national community context. The most characteristic feature of these apartment blocks are the above-ground bomb shelters on the corners of the buildings, of which 2 still exist.
This is where the Aryans were supposed to live after the victory, in relatively large, luxurious apartments. These apartment blocks were to be supplemented by huge shelters on the corner of each building, so that residents would have direct access to their designated bunker. The aim here, of course, was to coax the population into accepting a permanent state of mobility for war, even when they were in their homes.
The steel doors of one of the shelters still exist today. Each of these structures would offer protection to 200 people. The access doors from the apartments were walled up after the war. Today, the bunker is used as a storeroom. As of September 1939, the Third Reich was at war. The Nazi regime was quick to organize an entertainment program at home for war invalids and soldiers on leave. In Munich, the diversion of tea and dancing at the Seehaus in the English Garden helped Wehrmacht soldiers to take their minds off the horrors of war. When Nazi Germany began to rearm, Munich became an important center for the arms industry. One of the buildings grimly manifesting the increased armament of the Luftwaffe was the headquarters of Air Region Command 4 on Prinzregentenstraße. Today, the building houses Bavaria's Ministry of Economic Affairs. Not all of the relics of the Nazi past were removed after the war. Wehrmacht helmets still crown the window gables, and on a side street you can still see wrought iron railings decorated with swastikas. Although the war was clearly lost by the end of 1943, the Wehrmacht demonstrated its firm belief in final victory during a parade on Munich's Ludwigstraße. The 9th of November, 1943. Hitler was making his annual speech in the Bürgerbräu Keller in memory of the failed Nazi putsch.
In seiner Rede rechnet Adolf Hitler mit den Feinden Deutschlands ab. Deutsches Volk sei völlig beruhigt. Was auch kommen mag, wir werden es meistern. Am Ende steht der Sieg.
It was one of the dictator's last appearances in Munich. As the armaments production in the Third Reich was close to collapse, the Dachau concentration camp near the city was given a new function. The camp had been built for 5,000 political prisoners in March 1933. Himmler had personally chosen the site of a former munitions factory. The party newspaper, Völkischer Beobachter, reported,
"In this camp, all the communist functionaries will be concentrated, and, as far as necessary, members of the Social Democratic militia who endanger the safety of the state."
The capacity limit was soon reached, so the camp had to be extended.
More and more adversaries of the regime came. The old factory buildings had to be torn down, and new huts were constructed to put up a total of 10,000 prisoners. The majority of the people here were political prisoners who'd been deemed antisocial elements by the state and were to be reintegrated into society and forced to renounce their political beliefs.
Before long, many prisoners belonging to oppressed minorities, such as Jews, Sinti and Roma, were also brought here. In the night of broken glass alone, 11,000 Jews were deported to Dachau. These pictures, filmed shortly after the liberation of Dachau in May 1945, offer a mere glimpse of the inhuman conditions in the camp. Although Dachau was not an extermination camp, over 40,000 prisoners lost their lives here, not counting the thousands who were deported to the extermination camps.
It was a harsh regime, but this was not the worst, neither the beatings nor the thirst or the hunger. The Jewish prisoners lived in fear of no longer being fit for work, because as soon as the guards found out that you were no longer fit for work, you became a candidate for death.
It was mainly Jews capable of work who were to uphold Germany's battered arms industry during the final years of the war. Extermination through labor. Many prisoners were even transported to Dachau from other extermination camps in order to work for Munich-based armament factories. A dense network of over 400 slave labor camps existed in the Munich metropolitan area alone. Some of them were in the city center.
Das war wirklich kaum bekannt.
It was not widely known that a total of nearly 40 sub-camps of Dachau concentration camp had been set up in Munich. When you look at this map, you can see that they were scattered all over the city, so that everyone must have come face to face with the slave laborers, the prisoners of war, and the camp inmates on an almost daily basis.
Den Kriegsgefangenen und den KZ-Häftlingen konfrontiert worden ist.
In the area between Munich and Dachau, several sub-camps were constructed for inmates who worked as slave laborers for BMW. The camp in Allach held over 17,000 prisoners. Max Mannheimer was brought here to the Karlsfeld OT camp at the end of 1944. Of the original compound, only the kitchen section remains today. It is used as a hostel for athletes. Together with the other unskilled camp inmates, Mannheimer had to work outdoors. The trained men assembled aircraft engines in the halls.
As you can imagine, the controls were very strict, especially with the people working on the machine tools, because an aircraft engine is very sensitive. If something goes wrong, the plane will crash. Many people were executed for sabotage, although maybe they weren't acting deliberately. There were, however, many inmates who really were sabotaging the work, mainly French and Belgians, I think. There were a lot of French and Belgian inmates in the camp.
Production for the final victory continued until the end. The Americans liberated the camp on the 29th of April. One day later, the end of the Third Reich also dawned on the capital of the movement. Without encountering any resistance, US troops marched into Munich on the 1st of May 1945. 8 days before the unconditional capitulation of Nazi Germany, the American soldiers were welcomed by the population with white flags. Allied bombing raids had severely damaged Munich, and particularly the city centre, which had become an expanse of rubble. A major part of the Old Town centre was destroyed, but many of the prestigious buildings of the Nazis survived the bombings largely intact. Only the Brauners House, the symbol of the party's tyrannical rule, was totally destroyed. The occupying power later demolished some of the relics and shrines of the party's cult. The Nazis disguised their representational buildings from Allied bombers with camouflage nets. And this is why, to this day, Munich's cityscape is dotted with buildings from an era which the people in Bavaria's capital would rather forget.